So this is the third background video on our Modern Nations United States series. We're going to explore gender roles a little bit more. And so World War One had provided work and skills for women in the absence of males, and heading into the 1920s, the amount of working women increased by 25%. This increased economic security and freedom for women made divorce more common, and women received the vote in 1920. So there were some really positive steps for women in the early 20th century in the United States. But despite the flapper trend, which was mainly symbolic of the upper classes, society still had fairly rigid, meaning strict gender expectations. Married women who worked were frowned upon because motherhood was still seen as the ultimate career for a woman, being a housewife. Radio programs and magazines outlined cooking and cleaning innovations that were targeted very heavily still at women. Baby formula, processed food, innovative appliances also made housework more glamorous for women. And so, as you can see, there's still these fairly deeply ingrained expectations for women to take a secondary role to their working husbands. And this is a lot of what advertising looked like: women, having these traditional housewife type roles. During the early 20th century, there was a real increase in media. Here's the early sort of tabloids and print media. And today we live in a world where reality TV and social media is basically massive and basically runs our lives. But this early print media led to the rise of celebrities in the 1920s, and people started to follow celebrities and try and emulate their fashions and things like that. Charles Lindbergh was one of the early celebrities in the 1920s and 30s, and he became, I guess, a business in his own right just for being a celebrity. He was, famous for being an anti-war campaigner, and also there's an infamous kidnapping case involving the Lindberghs, which dominated a lot of the headlines in the 1930s. But following on from media, radio was another huge development and became a common form of entertainment and receiving news and that sort of thing. So radio, I guess, was the precursor to television, which came a lot later, and then the internet and social media, which we have today. And so in 1920, the first radio station opened, and by 1923, there were more than 500 radio stations. By 1930, 50 million Americans owned a radio. And following on from that, films were another development which I guess became synonymous with American culture and the rise of Hollywood, etc. in the early 20th century. Hollywood became the center of the film industry in the 1920s, mainly because of the filming location that California provided, and Los Angeles, the warm weather and the diverse landscapes for filming. The first film with talking in it, rather than a silent film, was The Jazz Singer in 1927. And through this, I guess you'd call it an entertainment boom, American culture began to be exported around the world. And here's a poster for the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, where Al Jolson, a white actor, has the blackface appearance to portray an African American, which I guess is 100 years ago, but shows some of those traditional racist views in America and things that were acceptable back then. In the 1920s, the jazz era emerged as well. The jazz musical style developed from African American music. And in 1925, jazz halls and traveling jazz bands were very popular, and this was another part of the culture that was exported overseas, and this soon grew into a worldwide phenomenon. But ironically, a lot of these jazz halls and jazz clubs, which featured African American jazz bands and singers, a lot of these jazz halls actually did not permit African American people to attend. So the performers were actually African American, but black people weren't allowed into these clubs, which again shows the this sort of racial contradiction that existed in early 20th century United States. Jazz also helped the radio industry to boom because of its popularity. The popularity of jazz music led to a rebirth of African American art and culture, and the New York borough of Harlem was where a lot of this culture was centered. Um, the Great Migration actually occurred in 1915 northwards, because a lot of those African American people that had traditionally lived in the South and worked, in relatively agricultural jobs because of their, their poor, exposure to education and having a lot less skills than white people. Now they had a bit of extra mobility heading to the north and looking for some of the industrial jobs required during World War One. So this Great Migration is where a lot of these African Americans headed north and sort of set up base in Harlem, and that's where this Harlem Renaissance came from. Another symbolic chapter of early 20th century US history is Prohibition. So Prohibition was basically where the US government prohibited the sale of alcohol, and this was known as the Noble Experiment. So I guess there were lots of reasons behind this, but this was called the Noble Experiment because alcohol was blamed for immorality and gambling and crime and lack of productivity. And so they, a lot of groups like the temperance movement and other religious groups wanted to ban alcohol, I guess on moral grounds more than anything, especially when American soldiers were fighting overseas or had just finished fighting in World War One. And so in 1920, the Volstead Act came into effect, which made Prohibition official and banned the production and sale of alcohol. So there were different camps that both supported and went against Prohibition. So the Dryers supported Prohibition and the Wets didn't like Prohibition. But I guess lots of people in the government thought that Prohibition would boost the economy because people would become more productive. I guess because they were not getting drunk and going out drinking a lot of the time. And then because of this, they would have more money to spend on other things like entertainment and consumer goods rather than alcohol. And so it wasn't just moral reasons, it was also economic reasons why they introduced Prohibition. But in reality, the government actually lost over $1 billion in taxes because of the closure of breweries, which caused widespread unemployment. Because alcohol was illegal, similar to lots of drugs today, a black market opened up where gangsters smuggled and controlled the alcohol trade. They became known as bootleggers, and they ran secret saloons behind closed doors called speakeasies where people could consume alcohol freely. And Al Capone is one of these notorious gangsters from that period who profited greatly from Prohibition. So approximately $2 billion went from the now illegal brewing industry straight to gangsters. And so cities like Chicago saw rivalry between gangsters like Al Capone and Bugs Moran. And there were over 500 gangland murders in this period, including the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929. So this Noble Experiment Prohibition actually caused more problems and more issues than it actually solved. Not only were the gangsters the main issue in Prohibition failing, but there weren't actually enough government resources to make Prohibition work. There weren't enough government agents to police Prohibition. There was only about 1,500 nationwide. These officials were actually poorly paid as well, and therefore they were easy to bribe. The US physically is just too large a country to police as well, especially with this small amount of agents, and smuggling was impossible to prevent. And lots of Americans actually didn't support Prohibition in the first place. There were the religious groups like the temperance movement who supported it on moral grounds, but lots of people also disagreed, and so it was already, I guess, fighting an uphill battle in lots of ways. And so that's why it's called the Noble Experiment. It was an experiment, but unfortunately the cons outweighed the pros. In the 1920s, about 60% of Americans went to church, but because of the ever-growing consumer society, there was a growing fear amongst these religious people that religion was actually losing its significance in American society, especially due to the trend of materialism, the worshipping of material goods, and secularism, which is, trying to separate the government and the church, those two institutions. So a famous symbol of this struggle is the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. In 1925, the Butler Act was passed, which prevented the teaching of evolution in American schools. And in 1925, 24-year-old John Scopes was arrested for breaching this evolution law. And so this was more than just the trial itself. It was a real opportunity for those two camps, the religious, fundamentalists, and the New Age thinkers, the evolutionists, actually coming head to head and advertising their views. And so this was actually a publicity stunt to bring money into this town in Dayton, which was a former mining town, and the trial turned into this carnival-like atmosphere and was broadcast across the country. Defense lawyers challenged the literal interpretation of the Bible, and although Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, this was a win for the evolutionists because it exposed the backward thinking and the backward nature of traditional religion in the country. So this was a huge blow for, the grip and the power that religion had on US society. And it shows, the slow decline of the significance of religion in the United States. So in conclusion, America in the 1920s had two identities. One, and this is what a lot of people worldwide saw, the wealthy, rapidly developing nation with a high standard of living, the land of promise, the land of plenty, where people had houses and cars and all these benefits of consumerism and all these material goods. But under the surface, under the Gilded Age, as they called it, America was also a nation where half its citizens lived below the poverty line and still battled this deeply entrenched racial intolerance and persecution. So that's the end of the background study on the United States, and it gives you a quick snapshot of lots of contradictions in American society, both good and bad, and how, despite the appearance of wealth and excess, everything was not as it seems.